My name's Taura Musgrove. I'm a filmmaker and graduate student in the new Johns Hopkins Film and Media Program. I'm also a Saul Zantz Foundation Innovation Fund Fellow. I'm here because I love film. It's my heart, always has been, and I'm just choosing to use the general accessibility and new technologies to arm young people and all of us with information about those women that are often, especially women of color, who are often omitted from film and media. My latest project is an augmented reality experience that I'm developing about Baltimore civil rights leader Lily Mae Carroll Jackson. So that's just a little teeny bit about me. I gotta say, that work, thank you, Mama Melanie, for speaking yesterday about the importance of grandmothers and mothers' voices in this work. And I'm just happy that these filmmakers have chosen to use their skill and expertise to not only focus on incarceration in this country, but to also be sure to highlight those mothers and grandmothers who are so key, who are so important, who are such the support with regards to these stories. And I'd like to welcome our two filmmakers. We had another film shown earlier for those of you who missed it. I'll just describe it a little bit for you. Our earlier film is by Brett Story. And I'm just going to bring Brett. Brett, you're up here. Come on down. Brett is a geographer and nonfiction filmmaker based out of New York and Toronto. Her films have screened at True and False, Hot Docs, the Biennale, among other film festivals. The film that we showed this morning, The Prison in 12 Landscapes, was awarded the Special Jury Prize at the Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival and was broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens in 2017. Brett holds a PhD in geography from the University of Toronto, and she's currently completing a book manuscript to be published by the University of California Press titled The Prison Out of Place. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at New York University's Center for Culture, Media, and History, and is a Sundance Institute Art of Nonfiction Fellow. Welcome, Brett Story. And our second filmmaker is Paul Abowd. Come on down, Paul. He's a journalist and filmmaker from right here in Baltimore, y'all. For the past 4 years, he's produced short films for Al Jazeera's Fault Lines, documentary series put on by the network. The Prison Factory is his latest film. And I just want to let you know he's also produced a short documentary about eviction defense that premiered at the DC Film Festival. And his work has also appeared in The Intercept, PBS NewsHour, Mother Jones, The Washington Post, NBC.com, The Huffington Post, In These Times, Z Magazine, and elsewhere. So you'll come across his work, I'm sure. So I know that we don't have a lot of time, right? We have some time, though. I'm going to move over to the table. And I did want to go back. Brett, do you mind if I just read the description from your website of your film? For those of you who didn't get to see it, I adore this film, and I just wanted to read a little bit of Brett's description to give you some context in case you missed it this morning. The Prison in 12 Landscapes is a film about the prison from the places we least expect to find it. It's a meditation on the prison and its disappearance in the era of mass incarceration. The Prison in 12 Landscapes unfolds as a cinematic journey through a series of places across the United States where prisons do work and affect lives, from an anti-sex offender pocket park in Los Angeles to a congregation of ex-incarcerated chess players shut out of the formal labor market, to the Appalachian coal town betting its future on the promise of a new prison and therefore new jobs. So I just wanted to start the conversation to just hear a little bit more about each of you and how you came to these projects. I know how hard it is to make a film, all the teamwork that goes into it, the years that often go into it. Paul, I bet you're on a much faster track in terms of this investigative journalism, but I just wanted to understand how these films and incarceration, the subject of incarceration, came to you. And then also wanted to just ask you about some of the challenges with finding these voices, selecting these voices, and following through to get these made.
Sure. Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, how great it is to be here. Thank you so much to Nathan and all the organizers that made this happen. I'm really sorry I wasn't here yesterday, but I heard discussion was lively and urgent and moving, and I really regret that I wasn't able to participate in it, but I'm really looking forward to today, so thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say about how this project began. You know, I've been doing different kinds of social justice organizing for a long time, and I really come to thinking about prison issues, prison and policing issues from originally from anti-poverty work. So I, for many years, have worked in anti-poverty organizations committed to dealing with homelessness and anti-gentrification work in particular in the Canadian context. And really, you can't do anti-poverty work. You can't think about homelessness and survival without coming pretty immediately and quickly to the problem of policing and the work of the criminal justice system. So that's really was my entry point. I'll also say that before I started making films, I worked in community radio, community and activist radio, and one of the first radio shows that I became involved in Montreal in the early 2000s was a radio show committed to being produced by and for prisoners inside. So it was made up entirely of phone calls, kind of like the ones that you heard, but folks on the inside who were calling in and talking about a wide range of issues and saying, don't forget about us. We're thinking, we're following, we have something to say about the mayor's race, about climate change. And it was really an opportunity to bring those voices into spaces that are, are otherwise organized to forget about people on the inside. And I think, for me, thinking about this project and thinking more generally about what a person who works in images, who works as a filmmaker might do or could do in regards to thinking about a cinematic exploration of issues of incarceration. I think I began really with this problem, this way in which prisons are, almost by definition, spaces of disappearance. They disappear people. That's what they do. They take people from their homes and their communities and their neighborhoods, and they put them against their will somewhere else, and they disappear them, and we're not supposed to see them, right? And they're also disappeared in lots of other ways. So, there's been a conversation about mass incarceration. One of the other things that's happened is prisons have exploded in sort of size and scope in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere, is that they're built further away than ever before from the neighborhoods and communities where prisoners often come from. And they're harder to get into, but they're harder to get into for activists, for loved ones, for lawyers, for researchers. And so there's all these ways in which the more people are disappeared inside, the more they're also disappeared on all sorts of other levels. So this was a sort of starting point for me, trying to think about, what might be possible, what might be useful about using images and thinking through what images can do to contest and combat a system that by design is meant to disappear people and disappear social problems, right? That's the other thing they do. So, that really sort of, for me, kind of engendered the early conceit for this project, which for those of you who saw it, and even those of you who just read the description, is premised on a kind of unusual idea, which is that it would be a film about the U.S. prison system in which we never see a prison. or we almost never see a prison. And instead, the film unfolds through these scenes that are situated in places that we don't, at first glance, think have anything to do with the prison system. There's a chess park, there's a coal mine, there's a wildfire. And the idea was that, that maybe there's, one way that we can bring issues of incarceration and the struggles of people inside to visibility is to bring cameras inside, or to let people who are doing their own documentation on the inside get those images out. But another possibility would be to actually point the camera everywhere but the actual penitentiary. And so this is what I try and do. And the suggestion is that maybe by looking elsewhere, by looking everywhere but the actual building, that we might start to rethink the role and the function of the prison system, and think about more broadly, more laterally, about how prisons intersect with other structures of power, with the job market, with the labor market, with real estate, social struggle, other structures of white supremacy, so on and so on. So I think that's enough to begin. Yeah.
Great to be here. I just wanted to shout out my old professor from Michigan Days, Professor Nathan Connolly, who invited me here.
The grad student at the
Yeah, he was my grad student instructor, and we had a great seminar together that I'll always remember as being formative in the way that I think critically about the world and do the work that I do. So thanks, Professor Connolly. Also want to thank these guys for sharing the panel with me, and especially Brett for making this film that I aspire to make, something like that, something so powerful. My approach to this film, The Prison Factory, came about as a result of reading about the national prison strikes, which happened last September, more than a year ago, and realizing that there really wasn't much to read about because it's almost impossible to find out the contours of what those actual protests looked like and felt like and actually were. And so it made me curious to know more about the people who are organizing under those circumstances, basically within this space of disappearance, as you call it. I think as a journalist, that's always a good invitation to be more curious and to look further and to try to, I took the opposite approach, Brett, which is to try to break through more concretely and maybe more on the nose of the subject and say, let's see if we can actually talk to the people who organized these protests. And what I found were a group of really remarkable people all over the country, but mostly these guys in Alabama who weren't just in prison, but who've been in solitary confinement for years on end. So it was remarkable to me to find out that they've been able to organize anything, let alone a strike that was coordinated across prisons within Alabama and across state lines. These guys are, and women also, I should mention, in California who participated in a walkout and work stoppage and faced violent repercussions all over the country. And so as I tried to get closer and closer to that story and what that looked like and what the fallout was, I came up against immediate sort of refusal of any sort of information, as many of you who work in or around prisons are probably familiar with, unless you're lawyers. I've found out that the few people who can go and see these guys in solitary are lawyers, and so they became really valuable resources in trying to fact find and get actual documentation of some of the attacks and the violent repercussions of these guys organizing activities. But just a couple examples of I requested access to all 50 states' prison industries factories, like the actual shop floors, and was denied by 49. Oregon, interestingly enough, was happy to have me, but it wasn't really, and didn't end up being apropos of this story. But I filed a FOIA request to get case reports and FOIA security footage of uprisings in Florida, which became quite violent both from inmates trying to take over different parts of the prison, but also the violent response of these sort of SWAT teams that come in to suppress uprisings. The bill that the Florida Department of Corrections presented me with to get that footage and those case files was $10,000. So if you go through that system, you quickly realize it's either you're not going to step foot in there, or it's going to be prohibitively costly to find out any of the basic facts of what went on. And so I was really overjoyed to find out that some of these guys were willing to speak to me on the phone and sort of circumvent all of that in a way that I think gets to the real heart of a lot of these issues.
And then just follow up, Paul, how challenging was it to get those conversations? And I'm assuming you talked to them first, you're filming later, but you're also on this insanely tight, timeline to get these things done. What does that kind of pressure cooker of investigative reporting and creating this film look like?
It's not fun.
I bet.
I had the good fortune of having a few months to sort of develop relationships with family members and activists. The guy, the pastor, Kenneth Glasgow, was instrumental in facilitating some of these conversations with guys on the inside. But just a lot of phone conversations, just I think a process of getting to know what these guys have been through. I think they were pretty ready and willing to share their stories and to take risks. I mean, Bennu has since been switched. Bennu and Kinetic have been moved from prison to prison, from solitary confinement unit to solitary confinement unit throughout the state of Alabama for several years because of the power that they have in the prison. So they build community. They take young inmates who've just arrived under their wing. There's a process of building a circle around political education and learning the law, like he was talking about. And obviously that's dangerous to the prison officials, so they move them a lot around so that they can't really establish and maintain those relationships in a meaningful way. They've come upon the opportunity to have this phone, but the phone is also the reason why they end up in solitary in a lot of ways. So it's really important for me to show this piece maybe more than any other because I know of the enormous risk that these guys have taken. And Bennu and I talked a lot about that because he basically knew once this came out that his phone would get taken away. And so he's got all of these magical ways to hide cell phones in an 8x12 cell, even when they're raiding him and looking for this phone. But he's now without a phone, and he's been switched to a new, the prison that Kinetic Justice was in, and they've traded places. And so that was something that ran through the whole process for me, and in our conversations, getting to a point where, for me, actually more than him, he was ready. I think he feels like if he doesn't do this, then he's going to die in this cell alone and no one will know. And so he's willing to take that risk. But I'd say that was the biggest thing we talked about for several weeks, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just had one other question to get us rolling. And then if you guys have questions, please chime in at any time. I really love the approach of a meditation on this subject and just kind of giving us the breath that you did, Brett, to experience people, places, a lot of nature. So I wanted you to just maybe talk to us a little bit about that. I was feeling like, oh, good, she's got nature kind of just like over everything. Kind of made me, give me hope in the midst of all of these really horrific situations, that something bigger was still in control. And so I just wanted you to talk about your approach to the narrative structure of this piece, and why you did it. And then please join in.
Yeah. Time and pacing are really important. Part of it is just, I think of myself as a political filmmaker, but think about a project like this as having a sort of different function than a piece for Fault Lines or something that's more journalistic and has a different kind of timeline. And I feel like, I'm really interested in, especially when it comes to these institutions of tremendous violence that have a very modern history. I mean, the penitentiary in this country is 200 years old, and yet it exists as if it has always been here and it always needs to. And so I'm really interested in finding sort of creative strategies for inviting people to rethink and feel kind of reestranged from something, that's as violent, as life destroying, as costly as a prison system. So really the sort of part of that kind of meditational quality in the film is just an invitation to give people space to think about some of the connections that occur between these different and disparate places, the sort of ways in which what the kind of theft of resources happening in a place like St. Louis connects to what people were revolting against and protesting against in Detroit and elsewhere in the late 1960s. But the other part of it for me is, I think that there's a lot of attention to the most sort of spectacular forms of violence, and I think, I'm glad you brought up mothers and grandmothers and wives and daughters and the people whose time and resources are also stolen by the prison system. And so time plays a role for me in this film in terms of trying to invite people to think about the forms of slow violence that gets produced, waiting in line to take a bus for 12 hours and maybe getting, refused entry on the other side. Standing in line in front of a school turned into a courthouse that might be the wrong address to pay $300 for something you don't have $300 to pay for, for hours and hours and hours. So there's this slow violence of how people's time and energy and money is taken. And so that I wanted that to be a felt experience as well as something, informational.
Absolutely. Any questions from the audience? Oh, okay. He's got to go back to work. Oh, here we do have one.
What y'all doing? This is about incarceration.
What's up, boy? Y'all about tired of me. Since this is about incarceration and y'all doing something that I want to do, y'all got access to knowledge and the ability to put a film together. I'm an independent filmmaker, but I'm a guerrilla filmmaker. I don't do that cutting and editing. I'm seriously, I just do it at the moment. Paul knows me, and Paul has seen me working, and I deal with this subject right here is my pet peeve. Prison industry, mass incarceration, and homelessness is my thing in Baltimore. I'm in the forefront of it. I fight it every day. And I learned that we're not in this fight by ourselves by coming to this place and this venue. You know what I'm saying? I look around the room. At first, I was mad because I didn't see us in the room. You know what I'm saying? But us ain't got time to be here because us just trying to live. Y'all got the luxury to be here. But with that luxury, y'all got to do something with this knowledge that y'all got. Y'all just can't keep it to yourself and say it was a good time moment, pat yourself on the back and say that's it. Y'all got to put a dog in the fight, or or get behind the dog that's in the fight. How that sound? So I appreciate y'all, and I am gonna be bothering y'all until y'all get tired of me.
I gotta say that's a good point. And I know we have another question. Well, maybe we'll do that first. We'll do your question first.
I want to build off of that a little bit more. When we talk about the use of film to engage people in conversation because everybody has seen the same film, what institutions have you been able to show this film with across the country. And Brett, Ellie with Arizona Humanities, so we got to show your film twice. But what other organizations, such as state-based humanities councils and such, have you been called to show this film, as well as what is the work in those communities that have come post-film, so that way we can put a dog into the fight?
Yeah, so the film the film came out in 2016, and it's played in a lot of really different kinds of contexts, which is, I think, important. So, you know, it did a festival thing, and then it's, for the past year, it's really been doing community screenings, and campus screenings have been sort of the most invitations I get are from organizations. The organization Critical Resistance in California has been traveling with the film. It's been playing at a lot of universities. It played on PBS. And really, I mean, it's just me with the film. I self-produced it. And so if folks in organizations come to me and want to show it or want to have access to it, we make that happen. And, you know, it's screened inside prisons, it's screened in churches, and I'm hoping that it'll continue to have that kind of diverse life and show to a lot of different kinds of audiences.
I just wanted to quickly, so Brett was willing to, I was someone who contacted you, and she was willing to let us watch it inside for the group Liberation Literacy that I talked about yesterday. So I wanted to publicly thank you for that, and just say that it was a really incredible conversation, and everyone really appreciated the opportunity and the film itself. So thank you for that.
Thank
you. I enjoyed both documentaries, or I should say both films. One of the questions I have has to do with considering that each of your films has played in different spaces. What if you had to locate an organization or a place that has done tremendous things with what it is you have produced? I'm curious to know what that has looked like. So, and let me just say that my question comes out of the impetus behind this conference, right? Like, how exactly do you bring together the humanities with incarceration? And one of the spoken and sometimes unspoken tensions is whether or not we theorize about the topic, or whether or not we're practicing freedom. And given the fact that your film, you know, both of your films do political work and artistic work, I'm curious to know if you have shown it in a space where an organization or a community has taken it and done fantastic things in terms of using it to advocate for whatever kind of change or protest. So I'm wondering, how has your work been used to mobilize people into the practice of freedom in the way that we would want freedom to occur?
Well, my sort of venue is broadcast television and the internet mostly, through Al Jazeera's sort of global network and stuff. But I did have a really great time showing this film at Red Emma's right across the street, which is where I met Shorty, oddly enough, and began to learn more about his story. And he invited me to his weekly screening in Baltimore called Dinner in a Movie. You're at lunch in a movie, so if you want to get dinner later, I don't know if it's on this week, but Shorty sets up in various street corners all over Baltimore City and projects what started as the 13th by Ava on the wall of the city jail in Baltimore, which was quickly attempted to be shut down. But he invited me to that. So my approach is to try to put this film out there as much as possible on TV and the internet, but I think what's even more useful are these more unconventional ways. That's Shorty's tagline. Yeah, just trying to see who connects to it, and if anyone has any ideas or if anything is sparked by watching it. I certainly want to meet you and talk to you more about it. And also on that note, I know that the family of Bennu and Kinetic are both looking for legal assistance and legal resources as they file and pursue their own legal appeals and innocence claims. So that's a specific thing that both their families wanted me to relay to this space. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It's a hard question for me to answer because, you know, I feel I have too much respect for activists to ever assume that a film could do what on the ground organizing does. And so when I make a film, I try and think about it in terms of how its piece in a long struggle that includes different kinds of work. And I also feel like, you know, there are kinds of films that have a much more sort of direct message with a set of, you know, possible impacts that can be measured. And I don't think that this is that kind of film. I feel like I hope, and I don't know, but I hope that it is used to invite people to both rethink what they think a prison is about. So one of the things that I was very careful about is making a film about the prison system that's not about crime, you know, that's not hung up on who did what, should they have done it, should it be, you know, are they innocent or not? Those are important questions, but they're outside of the parameters of this project. And this project was really about trying to think through, you know, how are we organized as a society? Where does the money go? Is the money going to give people jobs and housing and, you know, give coal miners in Appalachia something to do when the coal industry has gone in decline? And how does that connect to this system of mass incarceration that doesn't exist in this form anywhere else in the world? And so it's a hard film to sort of say, oh, well, there are going to be these kinds of social impacts, or it's going to contribute in this specific way to freedom struggle, but I deeply want it and hope, you know, I made it so that it could contribute to freedom struggle, and I hope that people find different ways of using it, whether as teachers or as, you know, sometimes it's just about creating space. So I like the idea of screenings because it gets people in a room. You know, and I like the idea of making a work that is, you know, a little bit oblique so that people want to talk about it afterwards and continue to share space. That's a mobilizing strategy. So I hope that it operates in those terms.
I just wanted to give a shout out with love and respect to the Reverend Kenneth Glasgow. He is a leader in the movement for formerly incarcerated people to identify their needs and self-determination. And he leads an organization called TOPS, that those of us that are returning and home, and as some would say, we haven't returned from anywhere. We never left. We've been living in the backyard. He has been just brilliant at creating with all of us, with the groups that he's met with, a document that's sort of a Bill of Rights for prisoners and for returning prisoners. And to me, that's as essential as the Constitution, because it's a document post-slavery, post-prison, that defines who we are, what we strive for, and what we do, and what we hope for future folks and generations that come behind us. So I would encourage everybody to take a look at TOPS, take a look at the documents that they've created. He's organized all across the entire United States. I've heard him speak. I've been in his presence. He's wonderful. He's like totally inspiring. It's like you're seeing one of the saints or the prophets when you talk to him. So check him out. Go Blue.
That's true. I'll just add, while you're walking over there, Pastor Glasgow's done a lot of inspirational speaking and organizing work, and he's also worked on the legal front to change the parameters of sentencing and the franchise too for Alabama inmates. I think he did something around ban the box in Alabama. That may have been like one of the first of those efforts, or early efforts there. So he's working on multiple fronts. But yeah, very inspiring person to be in touch with, for sure.
Hi, I just wanted to thank both of you for your films. I thought they were both really, really, really powerful. I missed the first part of your film, so if you address this in the film, then just excuse my ignorance. So my name is Nancy. I'm a white settler scholar of Indigenous literature. I'm also from Canada, living in the prairies right now. I work in a Indigenous Studies department. And something that, so thinking about land and landscapes, and this is a question that always comes to me, particularly at U.S. conferences, but also in Canada when thinking about the prison system, is the sort of way in which the prison system is set up to, so you were talking about disappearing people. I mean, I think in the Indigenous context, disappearing people and fragmenting families in order to continue to expropriate Indigenous land. And so the fact that we're in a settler colonial country here, as in Canada, seems really imperative to consider. And so I'm wondering what, I mean, I don't know if maybe that was considered in the first part of the film or not. And if it wasn't, then this is a larger question for the conference in general, I think, to consider is the role that Indigenous sovereignty plays when thinking about these issues and the role of the prison system as an attack. I mean, there's lots of very important, powerful discussion of the role of the prison system as a continuation of slavery. It's also a continuation of sort of the foundational practice of trying to disappear Indigenous peoples in order to claim this land as the USA or Canada. So I just wanted to put that out there as something that I think needs consideration, but the point about land made me think about that this might be an appropriate time to raise that. Thanks.
Just, I mean, I guess related to that, not exactly what you're talking about, but just, I was just struck by the direct correlation between the end of the slavery system, formal end in Alabama, and the transition to convict leasing, but also the rise of these the location of the prisons in Alabama are often former plantations. And so you've got, and in Louisiana too, you've got an image of a prison labor regime on the site of a former plantation in Louisiana with mostly black male inmates picking cotton, working the fields with a white prison guard on horseback with a rifle. That was one of the first things Pastor Glasgow talked to me about when we first met, was this sort of continuity of that imagery and the actual physical location of those things being the same place, the same land. Yeah.
In the Canadian context, I think that conversation, well, at least amongst sort of a quote-unquote progressive sphere, is around the continuum with the residential school system. So I think there's, that's a conversation, and I know there's the same system here in terms of the boarding school system, although it hasn't had as much sort of mainstream attention as the residential school system in Canada. But that's I had that conversation with people in a creative writing class at the jail that I do work at, and that's a really powerful conversation to have with people as well, who have lived experience of residential schools, and then are also now in the prison system.
Yeah, I'll just add that, I screen this film. I've screened this film a lot in Canada, and one of the very common questions I get, there's sort of different versions of this question, but the question is basically, could you have made a film like this set in the Canadian context? And I always say, of course I could have. Just because the scale isn't the same doesn't mean the racialized contours and a sort of phenomena that you can trace in similar, albeit different terms, doesn't exist as well in Canada, including, the growth of the prison system from the 1970s onward, tracking alongside rising levels of inequality and the intense hyper-incarceration of Indigenous people. So when I try and think that out loud, the first thing that comes to mind is that if I was setting this film in the Canadian context, I'd have a vignette set in along an oil pipeline, because this is where we see our Canadian government, turning pipeline protests, criminalizing pipeline protests, and the people on the front lines of defending land against these oil pipelines are Indigenous people on on treaty lands. And so, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's very important.
Just listening to these conversations, it reminds me of this French philosopher, I think it was French, who said the more things change, the more they remain the same. He was about in 1842, he said something like that. And basically, talking about the incarceration, taking over from slavery, it's basically the absolute same thing. One of my concern, it's not concern, it's just concern. But when we do these wonderful things that we're doing, and we go to groups like this, it's a committed group you have here. But sometime when we go back home, we think of making our salary, work, this, that, all the commitment that we have. There's not much to give to that. So the dedication and the devotion to really see that there's change takes 1,000 years, I think. So that's perhaps why we have one of that gentleman's name, I don't remember his name, and one Martin Luther King, you know, somebody who is just completely devoted. I wonder whether church groups would be one that we could always intentionally go and we could find some people from there. You know, we're not going to always find, but basically we could use whatever their religious belief is in equality and justice and all that sort of thing. But perhaps intentionally look at groups that we could go to begin to get some commitment. And very often I find that you have some of the very young people who are really committed, and old retired people like myself who go because the in-betweens, they are working, they're dealing with their children, they really feel good about it, but they don't have the time.
We'll take one last response here if you have it, and then we'll do a transition.
I mean, I guess I was just going to say that, I think that, while we're tracing out the continuities over time between the prison system and its and other structures of power that have preceded it, I think we need to do so. And this is an obvious point. I probably don't need to say so, but in a way that reminds us that that these structures are not inevitable. So we do have a prison system, a racist, classist prison system that does a lot of the same work that previous systems of systemic white supremacy have done. But that does not mean that it is inevitable for that to continue, right? And I think the part of the historical lesson is to learn from the struggles that have defeated those and brought those systems down, and that includes looking everywhere for who wants in on this long and necessary struggle.
Thank you all.